want to do is I want to move on then to the two other formats, the business venture proposal and the social entrepreneurship project. So the idea of the business venture proposal is that the student produces a document which substantiates the business case for the business venture that they are proposing. And what we're saying is the way they need to do that, the way they need to build their business case is going to be through the application of theory and through data collection. So we're not talking about a business plan that's a great idea. We're talking about something that they can present to potential partners, potential investors, venture capitalists, and so on, that then substantiates this good idea that they think they've got. So the process in that case would be, again, looking at what is the scope of the business. So a clear definition of kind of what are the boundaries of this organization, this business venture that they're planning to do. Who are the stakeholders in it? Defining the scope in that sense. I advise them then to choose 2, 3, maybe 4 key areas of that business venture that they need to kind of get right in order to build a business case. They can't do the whole business, that's going to be too complex. They can't look at every single aspect of it. Many aspects of the business are going to be fairly straightforward in many cases. They need to choose the key 2, 3, 4 issues that as an investor or as a partner, one wants to be satisfied are taken care of and addressed. And they need to build a business case around that. So the logical flow you'll see is quite similar then to the other formats in that there's context and scope of this business, then and identification of these key areas. Then it goes through a process of looking at what the theory is that might apply to those specific areas, if it is supply chain, if it's technology management, if it's marketing, whatever it happens to be. So there's some theory. Then there's going to be some data collection about the specifics that they are wanting to implement. It might be to try and quantify the market size. It might be to look at what the financial model is going to look like and so on. Coming through to then a business case that will probably have those key components in it that then says to the potential investor or venture capitalist and so on, this is something that is worth taking further. The social entrepreneurship project, yeah.
So just on that, I mean, is there financial forecasting and modeling around feasibility of that particular business idea? Is that included in the report?
We would typically expect that at some level. So it would depend on how critical that is to the business case as to whether one does a full-blown sensitivity analysis and sort of due diligence almost, or whether the issues are less around the finances. It would be difficult to understand a business case that had no financial model in it. All right. So yes, it probably needs to have some, but the level of detail of that financial model may vary depending on whether it's a big risk, financial risk or not. So yeah. Kajal, do you?
Yeah. So in this scenario, there's potentially where you would have no data collection, no statistical analysis.
Quite possibly, you wouldn't, but the danger of that is the fact that they're simply going to put down their ideas and their opinions. So what I say to them is that there's a saying, and I can't remember, I should be able to remember who the saying is attributed to, but without data you know more than another person with an opinion. Okay, so that's the danger of putting this idea together without any sort of data collection around that. Okay, so I do advise them to be able to substantiate with some data, because otherwise that risk comes in. Yeah.
That data that you're now going to do, does it still fall in line with the data that you do for a research article, consultancy reports? You need ethical approval and...
Well, yes, it would. Okay, but in some cases it might well be secondary data, in which case the ethics is a non-issue. But yes, it still requires the ethics clearance form to disclose it. Okay, they're not allowed to engage with human participants until such time as the proposal's been accepted and they've completed the ethics form. All right, that's absolutely the case. They can do secondary data collection if they want to, because there's no engagement there, but definitely they require those two things before they proceed with any actual field work at all. Okay. Yeah.
Can the business idea be completely lacking originality?
All right, tell me more. Just give me an example of it.
Well, I want to go and sell cell phones in Newcastle, and so.
Right. Okay, it doesn't have to be completely original is the simple answer. The problem is that in that case that they need to demonstrate that there's a gap in the market that they are going to be filling. That's part of the sort of criteria there. So provided they can do that, then it would be acceptable. But we're not looking at just opening another KFC franchise. That's not what we're talking about. So they would need to look at things like what is their sort of competitive advantage and that sort of thing. So it doesn't have to be absolutely novel, no.
So it could be an existing product, for example.
It can be an existing product, provided there's market needs and that sort of thing.
The problem statement becomes a little difficult because it's not a current problem really. It's kind of a futuristic view, and also the data collection of it. It's kind of what do you think you will be doing rather than what are you doing?
Right.
So how do you?
So in that case, the problem statement as such is, in fact in the business case generally, the problem statement is not so much what we would be looking for. We'd be looking at what is the scope of the business that they're talking about. So I had an example of a student who had this idea that was multifaceted in the sense of they were looking at the retail side, they were looking at the supply side, they were looking at manufacturing and so on, and it was a massive kind of open-ended thing. And I said, no, you've got to focus on one aspect of that so that you can delimit the business clearly. So she had a concept more than a business idea, and that's the danger, because concepts are different. They have no value, because you can't build a business case around this concept. So I'd be looking for, in the case that you're talking about, there needs to be enough specificity about it. A lot of people are coming to me at the moment and they're saying, they want to build a business that using the Internet of Things, or fourth industrial revolution, right? Great opportunity. And I say, okay, what is it within that you're actually planning to exploit? What is the boundaries of this organization? And they haven't really thought that through. So it's just pie in the sky, and that's not going to be something you can build a business case on. All right? So you might have great ideas and sort of think that there are these opportunities out there, but it has to be brought down to something that somebody's going to buy into and put money into. That's what we're looking for. All right, so typically I'll have to narrow it down. And even if it is a brand new product and a brand new service, and certainly some of our students are doing that, it needs to get to a point of where it's sufficiently specific, where they can then put a model on the table or put this proposal that is substantiated with the work that they've done to attract partners and investors. So I think that's the challenge there, because we don't just want good ideas. We want something that they can literally turn into an operation going forward, after it's been examined. Okay, so it's more challenging when they tackle that. Then moving on to the fourth format, which is the social entrepreneurship project. Essentially, that is the same as the business venture proposal in its expectations, except it's targeted at a different audience, and the rationale for this operation is different. So what we're saying is that the targeting of this business case is going to be towards potentially donors, community leaders, partners, yes. So it's not about the business as such. It's not about the market need potentially. What we're looking at there is something where there's the need or the potential for transformative social change, or potentially environmental impact could be the case as well. So the rationale for this is different. It's not just about having a bright idea. It's actually having a passion to make an intervention into society. And what we're also saying is that, and based on having spoken to a number of our alumni early on in this entire process, that what's necessary for a successful social entrepreneurship is to have some degree of personal investment or passion in that topic. All right? It's not something that you can pick off the shelf and say, I'm going to do a social entrepreneurship project. All right? You actually have to have a passion for it. And it's even one of the evaluation criteria is to see that personal investment or personal passion for that topic. So it's again about building the business case. We're looking for the sustainability of it. It may or may not be a non-profit organisation, so it can be a for-profit organisation if the impact is results in social change, but it doesn't. It could be either. All right. If it is going to be a non-profit, then the long-term sustainability may be a problem. If it's relying on donor funding, they would need to motivate why it is sustainable or how they're going to make it sustainable, because typically donor funding is not a long-term commitment. So those are the sort of things. But essentially, the process is going to be exactly the same. Building a business case. What's the revenue stream? What we're finding is that people on this are also looking at kind of good ideas, rather than an actual organisation that can be put into practice. So some people are sort of saying, well, this is something the government must do, right? That'll have a social impact. And we're saying, okay, but now that's just a good idea. What's it going to cost? How's it going to be funded? And if it's going to be funded by government, that's fine, but what's the probability of that? Is it actually going to be sustainable? And so on. So we need to be careful about just these things just being good ideas. All right. It needs to be something that is tangible in the sense that it becomes an organisation. It has boundaries. It has stakeholders, and so on. So both those would apply to the business venture proposal and the social entrepreneurship. There quite often are questions from students around the intellectual property of these different formats. And that comes from the fact that universities typically own the intellectual property of the research that's carried out. The reason for that, and I'm not a lawyer, by the way, so I hope there are no lawyers in the room, because I'm probably going to commit all sorts of legal issues. But what I've been told by our legal department is that the reason that the university owns the intellectual property is because the university is in the business of knowledge creation. And the underlying assumption around that is that any new knowledge that is created, any innovation that occurs through traditional research, comes about by virtue of the student being registered at the institution and being under the supervision of one of the academic staff. And that's why the intellectual property vests with the university. Now, that is not the case necessarily with these projects. So yes, it would apply almost certainly with the research article, and in that case the university would own the intellectual property of it. But in the case of, particularly the case of the business venture and the social entrepreneurship project, the university is not in the business of startups and social entrepreneurship projects. All right. So the university doesn't actually have a vested interest in that. And what we're looking for, and what you have sort of maybe have picked up from what I've been saying, is that the novelty of the idea for those comes from the student. So we do not propose to the student that they do a project, a social entrepreneurship in this area, or that they do a business venture proposal in the, with particular technology or product or service. All right, that comes from the student. The innovation, in terms of the law, as I understand it, therefore, the source of the innovation is the student, and therefore they own the intellectual property of it. Okay, so there becomes no sort of conflict of interest around that, provided you as supervisors don't contribute to the innovation, all right, because then you potentially have a say in that as well. So we're advising you, just for the sake of the sort of the clarity of the ownership of the intellectual property, don't provide the innovation to the student. All right, support them as a supervisor by all means, but the innovation must come from them. Then they own the intellectual property. The university doesn't, and it's relatively straightforward. So what happens is it will go to the library, and it will be accessible through the library. So it becomes a public document. And what I say to the students as well is that the point about the South African law is that if somebody were to take their document and turn it into a business, all right, they would be entitled to sue that person. But they would also need to be able to demonstrate that they have exploited the idea and that the other person stealing their idea, all right, has cost them money. If they can't demonstrate that, if they've done nothing with that idea, all right, then there's no point in taking it further, because how much have they lost? They've lost nothing. So a good idea has no value under South African law. You've got to have done something with it in order to be able to demonstrate that you have lost because of the actions of another person. Now, the point about that is that if you've got a bright idea, or if the student's got a bright idea, I should say, then they must exploit that to get any benefit from it. A bright idea on paper, nobody's going to buy that. All right. You need to actually take it further and do something with it. And because of the amount, sort of the lag and lead and lag time, you've got to jump on anybody else wanting to do it for a couple of years probably. And if you don't do anything with it in that time, then you may lose the opportunity. That is true. Okay, but the ownership does stay with the student. All right, and that's why we don't. Although I've asked you on the database to give us ideas, we primarily are obviously looking for researchable ideas, research articles, and potentially consulting input as well, consulting projects. But primarily, it's going to be research ideas. What I have found is that as students kind of understand their topic better, and as they formulate their topic better, they do tend to move between one or other formats, as we were sort of talking about in Bruce's case earlier. And there's no problem with that from an administrative point of view. They just have to re-register, just have to change their registration from the one format to the other. So we certainly don't lock them into that process. Okay, they are able to change. Let me just talk you through the process that the students go through, and then after the break, I'll talk about what's covered in lectures, and we can talk about the specifics, if there are any, around the supervisor responsibilities. So the process is as follows. The students will start their sessions with me roughly 12 months before their submission date. All right, so if it's a full-time program where it's a 12-month program, I have started with them, I had my first session with them already. All right, they will be submitting in February next year. The part-time program that started in January, they will be submitting in July next year. I will have my first session with them in the third quarter of this year. All right, so about 12 months. So the process is about a 12-month process. We go through 10 sessions with me, all right? So those are normally spread over 2 quarters, all right? So if we're starting at the beginning of the year, quarter one, quarter two, they will have those 10 sessions with me, and quarter 3, quarter 4 for the others. About roughly 6 months into the process, they will need to submit their proposals, all right? So the group that I started in quarter 3 last year are submitting their proposals now, and I suspect many of you are in that situation where your students are due to submit their proposals on the 28th of Feb. Now, I don't like to tell the students this, but that's actually a soft deadline. All right, and what I mean by that is that by arrangement with you, if they miss that deadline, it's not a train smash. There's no penalties. They've still got plenty of time to catch up by the time they get, in order to submit by July, which is going to be their cutoff point. All right. So roughly halfway through my lecture sessions, I would expect them to have a topic which enables me to allocate supervisors to them. Now, the way that is done, as you may have realized, is that you've completed that online database where you indicate the disciplines and methodologies and so on that you're comfortable with. The students, once they've identified a topic and an area, they complete the same database with the same fields in it, and I do a matching process. All right. So it is not an exact match, but I do try and get as close a match as possible. All right. So it really depends on sort of how many areas that covers and your own areas of interest as to how that matching takes place. But it's a process where I certainly try and optimize it for both parties. So roughly halfway into it, so they probably should have about 2 to 3 months working with you as supervisor to get it to the point of the proposal. They should be able to meet that deadline. All right, they should be able to. They have plenty of time. If they are not meeting that deadline, as I said, it's not a catastrophe, but the point is they're not managing their time particularly well. Once they've submitted the proposal to yourself, right, they then, and you give them the feedback, there's various documentation that goes then through to my office, and goes through to the faculty office from there. The reason it goes through my office is that at that point I check if there's any plagiarism on their submission, and if there is any evidence of plagiarism, we will hold on to the documents and we will withhold them rather than sending them through to faculty office. The student can proceed with their project, all right, because we can't stop them proceeding innocent until proved guilty. But what it does mean is if there is any evidence of plagiarism at that point, they won't be able to submit their final research, their final project report. Okay. Yep.
Sorry, do the students submit their proposal to us just via email, or is it
Yes.
done? And then once we mark it, how do we send the results in?
Okay, so there's an evaluation form, you give it back to the student, all right, and it's the student's responsibility to pass it through to our office. Okay, that's very important because that ensures that they get the feedback in writing, okay, and it means that they are responsible for getting the documentation through to us. So we don't have to chase up supervisors for those documents, and the student has a vested interest in getting the documents through to us because that's their process. Okay. Yep.
How do you detect plagiarism?
Okay.
Through Turnitin? Use of Turnitin?
We use Turnitin, but you obviously are familiar with Turnitin. Students often ask us, what's an acceptable percentage of the Turnitin? We don't use the percentage as a guideline. We use the report, the originality report, which we then review, because you can get situations where you get a high score even though it's correctly referenced. You can get a low score even if there's plagiarism. All right, so we review that Turnitin report. That's my responsibility. I go through that, and in that way we pick it up. So yes, we do that. And we don't use an absolute percentage because Turnitin is only a tool. It picks up similarity. So there are certain instances where you've maybe got a direct quote which has been correctly referenced. Turnitin will still flag it as similar, depending on how it's been
So
referenced.
as the supervisor, they sent me a mark to say they've done it.
You
They
don't
do that.
You
Okay,
don't have
send
to
it
worry
to
about
me.
it.
Okay.
Don't worry about that Turnitin report. It's not your responsibility. That's what I'm saying. You don't have to ask for it. If there is plagiarism, it's not your problem. It's not your business either. All right? We will handle it. Okay. So,
Okay, I understand that it's not our problem. However, there's a very nice program called DupliCheck. And that one, in other marking instances, I found to be very useful for finding plagiarism.
Yep.
The problem with Turnitin is that once you've checked that script against Turnitin, in fact it remembers it and then will give you a...
no.
No, is that...
No. It's been if that happen, that can happen,
Yeah.
but then it's been incorrectly set up.
Okay.
So we have set it up so that that doesn't happen.
Okay.
Okay. So in fact, the way it works is that their proposal doesn't get submitted to the database. Their final report does.
Does.
Okay, so that can't happen. They also get 3 opportunities, by default 3 opportunities, so they can see their Turnitin report themselves,
Okay.
all right, before their final submission. If they run out of submissions, they can always ask for another one anyway. But all I really want to say is, please don't worry about that. That's our business. We will manage it. Okay. So after that, then the students then carry on with their data collection, analysis, all of those good things. I warn them about December periods where it's difficult to get people to interview and get data. And then the final submission comes at be it February or July. Yeah.
So, Andy, is anybody helping them with their statistical analysis?
Okay, I certainly do assist them with that if they need it. We've had problems with some of the people that are contracted out. So yes, that is a way I can advise them on that. Okay, but that's just basically some number crunching. It's not about the interpretation.
No,
they have to
just
do that.
actual
Yeah.
numbers,
Yeah. Okay. The final submission is much the same. The one difference, though, is that there's the supervisor. We call it the supervisor acquiescence form, or that's the certificate where you say whether or not you approve of the submission or not, the student's final submission. Right now, just to be absolutely clear, you do not have to approve it. Right? Again, it's the student's responsibility for what they submit. If you're not happy with it, you simply tick the no box and you send it through to me. You don't return that form through to the student. All right? It comes straight through to me or to Samaya. That is the flag for me to check them for plagiarism again. All right, so their final submission is again checked. Again, notice that it's after you have kind of signed it off. All right, so again, no responsibility there. And that form then goes through the faculty office, and that triggers the examination process. Now, I just want to say something that is not implemented for this year, but will be implemented as of this time next year, as in submissions for the current new students. So any of you getting students coming up over the next month or so, which is a new cohort, it will apply to them. And that is that if they miss their final submission deadline, all right, so in other words, 28th of February for most of the students, or 31st of July for others, they will then be required to re-register, so there will be a financial penalty, all right, but they will also have their mark capped at 50%. All right. So this problem of late submission is going to carry a heavier penalty. Now we can't impose that now for the submissions at the end of this month, because that would be after the fact. So we're going to find that they're going to be late submissions. But the point is, for the next cohorts of students going forward, late submissions will mean that the mark is capped at 50%. In other words, they will still qualify to get their degree, but if they're looking for cum laude or anything like that, then that's going to be compromised. So we're expecting to create some greater urgency in the submission. And that's what I was saying, is that if you as a supervisor have been unavailable or there's been a problem, we're going to ask you to apply for an extension for the student of up to a month, all right? Because that then is out of the student's control potentially. But if the student has not produced good work and they end up overrunning the deadline because they're just keeping on having to do another submission or another write-up, that's going to cost them. Okay. So just to be aware of that is coming in down the line. Some of you might well be examiners as well for other students, all right, because we use the same database to allocate examiners, all right, but the supervisor does not examine. You do have a very brief form, just a few questions about the relationship and a recommended grade, but no, you do not examine. And after the student's work has been examined, it does get moderated by an external examiner in the same way as we would do with coursework. Comment about the 50% that I mentioned, the 50% for a delayed submission. The reason for that is that the 50% rule applies to students who are required to do major revisions. So if they've submitted something for examination and they're required to do major revisions, their mark is then capped at 50%. So we're applying the same kind of ruling in the sense that if they delay their submission, it's effectively the same as if they had kind of submitted rubbish and they needed to do major revisions. So that's the logic behind the 50% capping of their mark, so that they can't sort of do a bit of arbitraging around their timing. The other thing I wanted to mention that I don't think I talked about enough was the question of the evaluation criteria. Now, there's evaluation criteria are in the document that I circulated to when you were appointed as the supervisor or allocated as the supervisor. But just to understand how we've set those evaluation criteria up, they are specifically designed to meet the NQF Level 9 requirements, as I think I did mention. All right, so they pitched at a level that is appropriate. Now, what's actually quite interesting is that the students don't necessarily understand the semantics of some of those words. So I have a session, the same session where I cover the NQF Level 9 requirements. I actually spend a session with them to sort of discuss, and they discuss in their syndicate groups, what does it mean to analyze, for example? What does it mean to formulate? What does it mean to argue, and so on? So that they get a good understanding of what is expected of them. The problem being that about 80% of our students are not first language English speakers. So the nuances and the interpretation of those evaluation criteria, sometimes they miss out on it. They actually don't fully appreciate it. So we do spend a session on that. Now, each of the project formats has 20 evaluation criteria. All right, so that's for the final report. 10 of those are then listed for the proposal. All right, so when you get the proposal evaluation form, there are 10 evaluation criteria, which are exactly the same as basically the first 10 of the final evaluation criteria. The evaluation criteria are set up in such a way that 2/3 of them, 13 of the 20, are essentially exactly the same for all 4 formats. And that is to ensure consistency of the evaluation across the formats. And then the remaining 7 are customized to the format. So we've done that to, as I say, to ensure the consistency and make sure that there's no soft options coming through. And I think that's what we found. I was asked the question at tea time as to what is the sort of preferred format that students are following. Up to now, we've had roughly 50% of the students following the research article format and fairly evenly spread across the other 3. It seems to be changing now. I think people are getting more familiar with and understanding what the requirements are. So we seem to pick up more of the consultancy and the business venture proposal in the current cohorts that I'm dealing with. The social entrepreneurship is probably the one that is least popular. But I think that makes sense because, as I said to you, you really need to have a personal passion and almost be involved with something already in your life to follow the social entrepreneurship option. So that's just a little bit of background. Are there any questions about the evaluation criteria? As I said, I do see it as part of the supervisor's role to interrogate the students around those criteria. I see it as a major portion of the supervision process. So where are you demonstrating the integration of theories? Where have you addressed the issue of reliability and validity if it's a research article? So that's part of the process that I do anticipate. Any questions about the evaluation criteria?
Just from an expectation point, again, being very new to this process, is obviously written feedback in terms of the proposal. Is there an expectation to sit down and have an in-depth discussion around that as well? What are the expectations in terms of the interaction with the student around the proposal?
Okay, I think that's part of the negotiation that should happen up front. Every relationship is going to be different. If you're willing to have that level of detail, that's fine. I think that's probably going a bit beyond what would be expected. But if you're willing to, and if that's what the student needs, that's fine. But it is part of the negotiation. All right. So I'm expecting a fairly hands-off approach, to be quite honest, from the supervisors. All right, because it is independent study. It's about using your experience and guidance and practical knowledge and your wisdom to assist them, but they need to do the work. But it's very individualistic. Okay. Question?
Yeah. I probably just missed the detail in the pack that was there, but I'm more interested in the criteria for marking, and maybe to introduce just a bit of consistency. Is there some form of a marking rubric?
Yes.
So that we can evaluate these things consistently,
yes.
Especially looking at the 10 out of the 20 criteria. Is it in the pack, a rubric of some form?
Okay, so what we've got, the criteria are given in the pack, and then when you get when the student submits the proposal to you for evaluation, then there's a rubric. So what does it mean 50 to 60? What is it 60 to 70 and so on? And that is exactly the same as what will then be used by the final examiners. You would get it with the proposal, yeah. And the reason is that the student has to send you the appropriate set of evaluation criteria. So if they're doing a consultancy report, there's a rubric for the consultancy report. They've been told to send you the correct one. Okay, so that's where you'll see it. Okay, so the idea is that the students, the supervisors, the examiners, all are working off the same documentation. And that's how we've tried to get the consistency.
Okay, I've got a student who submitted their proposal. I've assessed their proposal in terms of those criteria.
Yes.
I've given them a mark. I've come up with 2 specific things that I'm unhappy about. They've gone off and changed those things and want to submit the revised proposal. Now, which one gets submitted?
Okay.
I'm not going to change my mark.
Yeah. Well, the point is that if you're happy that they proceed with their project, despite the weaknesses, that's absolutely fine. Your recommendations, those corrections that you're talking about, that must go into their final report. They can proceed.
But it's going to go into the proposal as well. Is that okay?
Yeah, if they want to, but they're just going to transfer that into the final one. But the one that you see, the point is there comes a point, and they've been told that You've had some engagement up to the point.
Both of our points I've had engagement with about.
Yeah. So when they feel they've got a proposal that is ready,
yes.
they submit it to you saying, please evaluate this version. Yes. All right. That's the one that gets marked and gets the written
But
feedback.
if they then change that one, I can allow them to submit that, but you're not.
Yeah, but I'm not interested in that really, unless there's a fundamental flaw. You see, it can be that there's a fundamental flaw and that you say to them, sorry, don't proceed until you've corrected
It's not a fundamental flaw. It's
then they can proceed.
It's 3 samples instead of 2, that sort of thing.
Then they can proceed. Yeah.
Actually, anything about use of English that we need to know about from your perspective?
Specifically, what do you
Well,
think?
all kinds of things. I mean, obviously, a lot of people are not writing in their first language.
Right.
A lot of people, even if they are writing in their first language, use kind of colloquial expressions which don't always seem appropriate. So I'm just,
Okay.
or mishearing words and spelling them wrongly, and all kinds of things.
So the point is that in the document we give them, we've given them a list of editors, language editors, and we would certainly expect them to use those. If it's not up to scratch, all right, as a supervisor, what you should tell them that it's not up to scratch and that they must do something about it. It's not up to you to correct that. Okay, we are unfortunately having huge problems with the language usage. All right, it is very problematic. The faculty have got of Commerce Law and Management have got somebody that's looking into this and so on. The real issue, I believe, is that they're not reading enough. So that would actually address some of the issues there. But it is something we're struggling with. But refer them to a language editor, but it's definitely not your role to correct it. And the requirement is that language editor doesn't add any intellectual content to it. So I'm afraid the student has to take responsibility for that. And if they're not communicating the concepts adequately, that will compromise their final report, yes. So they need to try and get it up to speed as best they can, and the reading is the best way of doing that. I had a conversation with one class about exactly this, and there was sort of the expectation, is there something online that I could sort of spend an hour, watch an hour video and improve my English language? Well, it's not going to work that way. It's something that develops over time, and if a person's got a weakness in that area, it's going to remain a weakness within the scope of this project, I'm afraid. So I think your role as supervisor is to point that out, not to go beyond that.
When you're briefing the students, do you point out to them that, in fact, this whole process is preparing them for a business life?
I make a very strong point about that, and particularly with regard to the new formats, and saying to them, if you write a consultancy report that is as robust and as rigorous as we're expecting, it will set you apart from others. And if you do a business case, all right, that is not just a business plan with a bright idea, but that is rigorously presented, you will set yourself apart. So that's exactly how I present it to them. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
I was just going to ask about references, because I've made my students change from quoting TED Talks and YouTube videos.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we all know what you're saying there, all right? And I think that with the new formats, there is more flexibility around that. So if you're doing a consultancy report, then quoting a McKinsey's article or a McKinsey's consulting report becomes more acceptable than if you're doing a research article. So I think that there is more flexibility around that than we would have allowed previously, but within reason. You see, what I always say to the students is, you can use those, but don't use them as your theory base. You see, because it's not theory, all right? It's anecdotal, it's historical, it's case studies, and that's okay. You can use those, but understand what they are and what they are for what they are. All right, so I think we can be more flexible in that, but certainly we don't want to have 30 websites as the references. Okay, that's problematic. That is definitely problematic. My experience is that there's some students that it doesn't matter how much guidance you give them, they're still not going to do a good piece of work. They'll still be compromised. So that's what we would expect. So yes, we recognize that there's the potential for a minor conflict of interest, but it doesn't actually impact substantially on the final outcome.
Do the students get feedback at the proposal stage once it's submitted? Because I understood that the proposal had to somehow be approved, not by the supervisor, by you, before they can continue on to the
No, that's a
that
common
a
misunderstanding. Okay, so I do not approve, and there's no formal process of approval of the project. You are the one that gives the go-ahead. So there's two criteria for them proceeding: you approving the proposal and then completing the ethics form. Right? Those are the only two criteria. What does happen is that the title will go for approval to the postgrad committee, but it's only the title. The go-ahead is something that you are giving. Okay, so definitely, but there has been some confusion around that because of what we used to do previously. Simply the magnitude of the number, the number of them, it just makes it impossible for us to really go through those in detail.
I'm glad you're raising that. So, because when we get allocated the students, they already have a rough idea of their topics.
Yes.
So we still need to guide them on structuring those topics so that by the time
Yes.
it goes for final approval, it's a properly structured topic.
Correct.